Adam, what are we fighting for?
Well, we're fighting for freedom, prosperity, and I hope a better future for all.
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we explore protests and revolutions, past and present, and try to make sense of it all. I'm Sam, and joining me, as always, is a man so charismatic that he once talked his way onto a plane in America without his passport. Adam, how are you today?
I didn't know where you were going with that, but yes, I did do that once. I don't know if charisma is the right word. Desperation and charming accent helped. But I'm doing well, Sam. I'm doing well. I'm at my grandma's house, which is always nice. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I want to give a little context to that. I think you had gotten off a train on the way to Seattle and were in a tiny town
from Chicago,
in Montana, yes. Big sky country.
Yep, Shelby.
And you wandered off, came back. The train was due to leave later, but it was gone, along with your stuff.
It left early, yeah, with my stuff, yeah.
And you had to rush to the tiny municipal airport that was like 100 miles away.
Yeah, I got a bus to Great Falls, which wasn't a bus, it was a guy who owned a bus, and I didn't have my passport, I didn't have my belongings, I didn't have a jacket.
Yeah. And he managed to talk his way onto the plane using like a Swiss ID card that they had never seen before. To be fair, I don't think those guys had ever seen a passport either.
They said, "What's this?" I said, "A government ID." They said, "Which government?" I said, "Switzerland." They said, "That's not going to work." But then it did. So
yeah, he was on his way here. So
yeah.
He had to break his creed of flying to go try to catch his passport in Seattle. And it worked.
It worked. I got it back.
So anyway, you asked how I'm doing. I'm doing all right, all things considered. I saw someone describe the U.S. as being in a cold civil war this week, and I would say that is accurate. So for context, we're recording this on the 11th of October, 2025, and this week, Texas sent its National Guard to Chicago to, quote, quell the violent insurrection on the streets there. Also, the Oregon National Guard was deployed for the opposite reason. Their commanding general, Brigadier General Alan Grunwald, stated that the purpose of troop presence in Portland was to defend the citizens' right to protest against ICE, who have descended upon the city this week.
So I'd heard about National Guard being deployed and troops on the streets in Portland. I didn't realize it was the Texas National Guard going to Illinois. That is crazy and is really very provocative action from the Trump administration. And I didn't know that the Oregon National Guard had been deployed to support the people of Portland against ICE. Cold Civil War, I think, is an interesting term and on some level reflects the sort of tense nature of the situation and the militarization of the US and the sort of occupation from within that is going on there. However, I don't know that there is enough of a substantial opposition for the Cold War label to apply. In the Cold War that we all know and love, that was between the United States and the Soviet Union, these are two big powers, right? Whatever you think about the Soviet Union, it was a solid state with a solid ideology. I don't know that such a thing exists in the United States. There's the MAGA Republicans and the Democratic Party, they're complicit in many of these actions and paying lip service opposition at best. So I don't know that the opposition is even there for it to be considered a Cold War.
That's an interesting point. The response from the Democrats to what's going on in Chicago has been Pritzker, their governor, has been going on like Jimmy Kimmel or something and joking about how they're making him have ketchup on hot dogs or something. That was like the liberal response to all this. Amongst all this news, a hero has emerged, and rather than having an Independence Day of the week, I would like to highlight a protest hero of the week.
Okay, I'm here for it.
Adam, have you seen anything about the Portland Frog this week?
No, this is news to me. Enlighten me about the Portland Frog.
Yes, okay. So I'm going to refrain from using their real name because it seems they would rather remain a symbol. But for those that don't know, including Adam, there's a person that has been protesting outside of the ICE facility in Portland every night since June in an inflatable frog or toad suit.
Awesome.
And they've gained more attention this week because the Trump administration has recently declared Portland to be, quote, war-torn and, quote, overrun by Antifa terrorists, which is now an official designation by the Trump administration, by the way. Antifa not being an actual organization, though they have claimed that they have the danger power, I guess, as Hamas or Hezbollah. They've cited as being equally as violent and extreme as Antifa.
That is crazy to me, because I'm sure maybe not Trump himself, but those in the administration know that this is not an organization. But I think the average sort of Republican voter, the average MAGA voter, doesn't know this, that Antifa is not an organization. It is a broad label that is applied to lots of different groups that oppose fascism. Maybe they share some aesthetic similarities, but there is no, like, terror cell of Antifa. There's no high command of Antifa, right? It's just a label that some groups have adopted, a vague ideology at best.
And maybe look in the mirror if you're saying that anti-fascists are a danger to your administration, right?
Yeah. And anti-fascist organizations include the United States in 1943.
Right. And Trump has sent Kristi Noem to oversee this operation personally in Portland.
She's the defense secretary?
She is the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security.
Right.
She's the one that oversaw the building of Alligator Alcatraz and is nominally in charge of ICE. Yeah, ICE and federal officials have gotten excessively violent this week in Portland, and a clip went viral of an officer spraying pepper spray or mace, it's unclear, into the breathing apparatus of this guy's frog suit who was just standing there. And this caused a domino effect, really a Streisand effect of people now really caring about these protests in Portland. And a bunch of people have come out to support. And there's now a zoo of inflatable animals protesting outside the ICE facility every night. And it's inspired a lot of people around the world.
That's great.
At the heart of this, there's really an objective good to this cause. The frog... He was interviewed in his frog suit or toad suit, and can you read what he said to the reporter?
I come out here day in and day out since June because I am worried about my community. I don't want to see anyone treated inhumanely, and to see this happen to my community members, my friends, my family, my neighbors.
It gives me vibes of the man we've spoken of before in the Vietnam War, just a bit sillier than a candle outside the White House. A reporter also spoke to someone in a chicken suit, and this is what they had to say about the whole thing.
What they rely on is fear. So by coming out here in an absurdist manner, it speaks to them, to some extent, that we're actually not that afraid. It also dismantles their narrative a little bit. When they try to describe this situation as war-torn, it becomes so much harder to take them seriously when they have to post a video saying Kristi Noem is up on the balcony staring over Antifa's army, and it's like 8 journalists and 5 protesters, and one of them is in a chicken suit. That's brilliant.
Yeah, so what do you think about this protest strategy, Adam?
I think it's interesting. I think it is good at grabbing headlines and bringing attention onto itself. Interesting that I hadn't heard of it. I get a lot of American news, more so than the average European, I would say. I have a lot of friends in America, and I'm quite plugged into American news. But I didn't hear about this, which I think is interesting in itself. I think that in the past and in previous sort of authoritarian regimes, humor and mockery was a very powerful tool for undermining them, because they base their legitimacy on a sort of aesthetic of seriousness. If you look at sort of the Nazis and their sharp Hugo Boss uniforms and how they're all dressed, and they're calling back to Norse symbols and all of that, I think there is a sort of a desire to be taken seriously in that sense. And even someone like Nick Fuentes, the neo-Nazi streamer, he wears a suit to his live streams as an attempt to sort of adopt this serious aesthetic. The Trump administration in itself, though, I think has made a strategy of unseriousness. There's another podcast, the Blind Boy podcast, and I can't remember his real name, but he goes by Blind Boy, and he makes the argument, which I found quite convincing, that one of the most powerful influences in American politics today is kayfabe, which is an idea from wrestling. The idea that there is a fiction there that we're all buying into, and we all know that it's fiction, but we buy into it anyway. But it means that the villains aren't really villains. And sort of humor is a key tool of kayfabe. Like, they are more aware of their own ridiculousness than I think liberals and the left would like to credit them. However, that's at an overall strategic level.
Right.
If that filters through to your average Republican voter, maybe that is a more effective tool in that sense. And even if it's not, it is, I think, something that can inspire people who might be wanting to go out and protest but find the whole thing quite intimidating.
Yeah, I think there's two branches of that in the Trump administration, and that you have like the clowns and then you have the people demanding respect. And I think with the average Republican voter, they do want to see themselves as serious too. So I think this may work in that regard. And it did catch fire a bit because I found it pretty amusing that when I was looking for news articles about this, there were some in the Sydney Morning Herald in Australia, the Hindustan Times and the Times of India, and the Telegraph in the UK.
Okay. Very right-wing paper.
Sure, but just to show that it's made it across several oceans at this point.
Rare blind spot for me. Glad to hear about it here on the pod.
So I think I speak for both of us in that we stand with all the Portland animals out there fighting
Absolutely.
the good fight. All in all, this frog/toad gives people some hope that someone cares about them at the end of the day. And to close out this short discussion, which I wanted to begin with, can you read to us how that protester describes themselves?
A little gay non-binary toad and proud Antifa terrorist.
There you go. Heroes can come from anywhere. On to our topic of the day. Adam, 75 years ago, emerging from the unimaginable horror of World War and genocide, the nations of the world came together to sign one of the most ambitious documents in human history, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was a promise of dignity, of justice, of a better world for everyone. But today, in an age of mass surveillance, rising authoritarianism, and collapsing social contracts, that promise feels more like a stain on the conscience of global power. So today we're asking the fundamental question. In 1948, the world promised us universal human rights. So why does it feel like we're still waiting for the delivery of that promise? So today we're diving into this declaration from 1948, and we're going to be looking at what we can and should be applying today from it, but also provide a bit of a critique from a leftist perspective, because this is a very liberal document with a capital L at the end of the day. So let's talk about it. And to talk about the UN, their formation, and this declaration, we first have to look at its precursor, the League of Nations. The League of Nations was founded in 1919 after the First World War, and it pretty much immediately failed, with declarations that led to horrifying consequences, like in the post-Ottoman Balkans, amongst other places as well. Pretty much their immediate attempts to instill peace throughout the world did the opposite. But the League of Nations was the first major attempt at a global governance body, but its fatal flaws were its idealism and its embedded colonial structure of it all, because at this time, British Empire still at least had the map, as well as France. Power itself was waning in these places at the time, but nominally these powers still controlled a vast majority of the world's landmass. I wanted to point to some specific failures of the League of Nations, and Manchuria in 1931 was a big one. This was Japan's invasion of Chinese-controlled Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned it, but it took no concrete action. In fact, Japan just withdrew from the League of Nations as a result. This led to that domino effect of the continued conquest of China by Japan and the untold horrors that led up to World War II. Abyssinia, aka Ethiopia, in 1935, Benito Mussolini invaded, and the League of Nations imposed weak sanctions, but excluded oil from those sanctions, which was a big part of Italy's economy with control of Libya.
Oil and steel and bauxite, all of which were required to produce weapons for the Italians. And as I recall from my history class in high school, weapons imports to Ethiopia were banned, but not to Italy, which in effect meant that the Italians had lots of weapons and the Ethiopians, the Abyssinians, didn't have any.
Yeah, and in fact there was a pact between Britain and France that proposed a solution to all this, which was to simply legitimize Italy's claim over Ethiopia, revealing that imperial interests of the great powers ultimately had the final say in the League of Nations. Ethiopia's Emperor Haile Selassie gave a speech to the League of Nations in 1936 and said, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." Now, Adam, the League's failure in Abyssinia/Ethiopia was a classic case of imperial powers prioritizing their own interests for collective security. Have you seen similar dynamics play out in modern protest movements where the powerful institutions protect each other rather than upholding their stated principles?
Yeah, I mean, constantly. I struggle to think of an example where that hasn't happened. If we use the example now of Gaza, then you'll notice that although the International Criminal Court, the United Nations, have dozens, if not hundreds of NGOs and human rights organizations have declared what is happening in Gaza to be a genocide, governments, particularly more powerful Western governments, are reticent to do so, are reluctant to label the events in Gaza as a genocide because under UN conventions, which have been ratified in all of these countries, if they acknowledge it to be a genocide, then they have legal obligations to act upon that, and it is not in their interests to do so. There are countless examples of the Congo, right? The ongoing human rights abuses in the Congo are largely around the extraction of resource minerals from the Congo. I had a friend who spent many years living in Rwanda and noted that wherever there was a strong Rwandan army presence in the country, that was around French-owned oil wells, and that the army was there to support French powers there. Diego Garcia are some islands that are nominally owned by Britain. Every single islander was forcibly displaced from these islands in order to turn it into effectively an American military base. First a British military base, but then basically all of Britain's overseas military bases were ceded to the US in exchange for support during the Second World War. So yeah, constantly, to answer your question. Something that is also notable about the League of Nations is that the United States, which became a world power at the start of the 20th century, it's sort of the Spanish-American War in the 1890s was the US's entry onto the global scene, and then its role in the end of the First World War as being the sort of last remaining industrial power, and a remarkably competent one at that, left it a global power in 1919. The US never joined the League of Nations, pursued a deliberately isolationist policy throughout the 1920s and early 1930s.
Well, and it was one of their presidents that led the founding of the League of Nations. Yeah. And then he was vetoed joining by his Congress, right? So I think it was Wilson.
Wilson?
Right?
Yeah.
He's an interesting figure because from what I understand, historically, he's fairly well liked in Europe. There are a lot of statues of him in Europe, hated in the US. And I think there are a lot more statues of him in Europe than there are in America.
Interesting. I could believe that. That tracks to me. I think he was quite authoritarian in the US, but he helped out Europe a lot.
Fair enough. I wasn't around back then. I don't know.
Me neither. This is half remembered from history class a decade ago. So.
But anyway, I mean, these constant failures of the League of Nations eventually dominoed into what became World War II. The start date of that war depends on what country you're studying from, right? US says 1941, Britain says 1939, China says 1936, I believe. I mean, you could even go back to 31 with the invasion of Manchuria, and this just collapsed the League of Nations, obviously. And in the aftermath, in 1945, the United Nations was founded as one institution that would not fail this time. It was the product of an Allied victory in the war, and its structure reflected that. And there was a key apparatus placed on the UN from the start, and that's the Security Council vote.
So the Security Council is a body within the sort of apparatus of the United Nations that can make binding resolutions. They can, in theory, act quickly to respond to global emergencies and make decrees that every country that's a part of the United Nations has to follow. Most of the members of the United Nations rotate within a number of years. They will rotate the countries that are part of the Security Council. There are 5 permanent members of the Security Council that have veto power for resolutions passed within the Security Council. These are the United States, which holds by far the most vetoes of any of these countries, Britain, France, Russia, taking its place as the successor state of the Soviet Union, which held that seat for a long time, and the People's Republic of China, which took over from the Republic of China in the 1970s, when I think it was Nixon realized that the People's Republic was a much bigger market than Taiwan. So these are called the P5 countries, the permanent five.
Yeah, exactly. So this structure that still exists today and really shapes the world we live in now was established right at the end of World War II. And that really just shapes how everything works geopolitically. How does this origin story shape its culture and power structures today, Adam? Like, can an institution born from a specific power dynamic ever truly be universal as the United Nations claims to be?
It's a tricky question because the United Nations, I do think, has had a lot of successes overall as an organization, partly as a forum, because you have the Security Council, which is sort of I guess, the executive committee of the United Nations, but then you have the General Assembly, and there every nation gets to speak in a fora with other nations in an official way. And when you look at UN agencies that have passed public health standards and things like that, there have for sure been some successes there, but ultimately it is an organization that is the values of economic development, especially since the 1990s, has been an American capitalist agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And the Soviet Union existed as a somewhat powerful bulwark against that, but there does seem to have been, throughout much of the history of the UN, a genuine sense of collaboration between the great powers, but it has not obviously solved global conflict or anything like that.
Well, and I think the imbalance is just shown in the fact that the main headquarters for the UN is in New York City.
Yes.
Take with that what you will. But I wanted to ask you sort of a question from your anthropological perspective, because we're going to get into the 1948 Declaration of Universal Human Rights, which the UN felt as a need to state what these rights are that they're protecting around the world.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we even begin to construct a universal concept of rights? Because this is a very Western Enlightenment era idea that's inherently flawed when applied globally. Or is there a core material need for the dignity that transcends culture?
The American Anthropological Association released a declaration in response to the Declaration of Human Rights, which basically argued that you also had to consider cultural rights. They acknowledged that the Declaration of Human Rights is written from a capital L liberal perspective and does promote a liberal worldview, right? This is not to say that this is bad. This is all good. I've got the Declaration open in front of me. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. Everyone has the right to a nationality. Fine, that's okay. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. The very first one is all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's good stuff. The American Anthropological Association wrote this sort of response to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which argued that we also have to bear in mind cultural rights and that cultures have their own view on things and their own ways of doing things. That text in itself has been dissected basically ever since within anthropology. That was in the 1940s or 50s, which was still a pretty dark era of anthropology. It was the anthropology in the early 20th century was called the handmaiden of colonialism and was effectively the science of justifying colonialism. And the discipline has been trying to forge its identity separate from that ever since. So that in itself raises this question of, okay, you can bear in mind cultural rights and the different ways that different groups might think about this. But then that raises questions of, okay, who gets to speak for this culture? Who gets to speak for this nationality, right? And so whilst I do think that the UN Declaration of Human Rights is speaking from a specific historical, political, cultural lens, critiques of that have to bear in mind power at all times and the power that exists within different groups in how they might speak about these issues from different perspectives.
I think it's apt So let's dive into this declaration and how it began. I mean, it was drafted in 1948 amidst the rebuilding of Asia and Europe, amidst the rise of Cold War politics. And there was a committee that was headed by 5 people, but that got input from others on this. And I wanted to point out who was on that committee and who contributed the most to this.
The committee writing this document.
Exactly, yeah. Writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The chair of this committee, Eleanor Roosevelt. This was FDR's wife.
Oh, he would have been dead at this point.
Yeah, he was dead at this point. He died in 1944. Many contribute Eleanor Roosevelt as being a key decision maker and confidant of her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And she is seen as being a bit more compassionate than him as well. So that I think there is a myth about FDR and that he is held up as a hero of socialism in the US as being like the only time it's been implemented and worked. Though the way that is taught in American schools is kind of that this was him pulling himself up by the bootstraps, sacrificing the capitalist economy to pull America out of the Great Depression, or at least trying in his own way. Conservatives critique this effort as not being proven to have worked because World War II happened and the economy shifted at that point, whereas pro-socialist people say, well, it was working. One thing I've learned over the years is that FDR himself was not passionate about these projects. It was more of a fear of a growing communist party in the US at the time that he wanted to throw a bone to, because you can't just have people starving with no jobs in the street. That will lead to these communist revolutions that were happening throughout the world in fairly recent years. And another factor was, some say, his wife on input to some of these decisions. And she became a staunch diplomat after his death as well. She was the chair, an American. There was Charles Malik from Lebanon. There was P.C. Chung from the Republic of China.
That's Taiwan.
Well, at the time, it was in civil war.
Sure.
So it was like half of China.
Sure.
And losing badly. René Cécine, I believe it's pronounced, who was French, and John Humphrey from Canada. Now, the reason they were chosen was for diversity's sake, but as you can tell, this is not really a diverse committee. Malik from Lebanon was sent to represent like the third world and to represent the smaller nations, but one, he was a Christian in Lebanon, which does not speak for most people in Lebanon.
No, it does not.
And two, Lebanon was very much in the French pocket at the time. So he was not necessarily speaking for the non-aligned part of the world. Chong, as we put, is from what became Taiwan. So not a very good spokesman for East Asia as a whole, especially because they were in the pocket of the US. France, they got to be there. And Cécine was an instrumental figure in the French resistance during the war. And I'm not really sure why Humphrey from Canada was included. I guess that's the British side, while also claiming not Britain. And as you can hear, there was no Soviet representative as a main person on this committee. They did eventually contribute a little bit, and likewise, there was very little African or Latin American input at all in this whole project. And the drafters of this came from nominally diverse backgrounds, but the document's still rooted in that post-Enlightenment individualist worldview. So where do you see the biggest tension?
Well, I suppose it's speaking largely from a Western capitalist perspective. Even in the case of China, the Republic of China, that's a pro-Western, pro-capitalist movement. I can't speak for, was it Charles Malik, you said? Malik?
Yeah.
The Lebanese man. Lebanon's a very interesting country in how it's split along sectarian lines. The Christian population and the Sunni and the Shia populations, as well as the north-south divide, very divided country. But if you are a Christian Lebanese, you are much more likely to be very pro-Western, basically. So without knowing much about him specifically, it seems that he was representing the quote-unquote third world, which at the time just meant not aligned to either the Soviet Union or the United States in the most sort of pro-US way possible, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's good insight. But there are 3 classifications of rights within this framework. So there's the beginning of the document, which is the civil and political rights, which are Articles 1 through 21. There's the economic, social, and cultural rights, which are 22 through 27. And then solidarity rights, 28 through 30. And the first classification, the civil and political rights, they're pretty basic, but as we go through them, you can see that they're still kind of impeded on by society today. Like, these are not rights that are given universally. And just to highlight a few, I mean, Article 3 is right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 4, freedom from slavery. Article 5, freedom from torture and cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. 9 is freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention. 10, right for a fair trial. 13, freedom of movement. 18, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. 19, freedom of opinion and expression. 20, freedom of assembly and association. And 21, right to take part in government. And almost all of those, as we sit here in the UK and America, we don't even have that here, you know?
Yeah.
Let alone like Dubai that has slaves.
Well, I mean, so does the US, right? Like the 13th Amendment says freedom from slavery except as punishment for a crime.
True. I voted on that for California in the last election. I don't think it went the way I wanted it to. That is to say, I think we still have slavery in the prison system here.
It would be wild if this was how you came out as pro-slavery.
No.
More slaves.
The way I worded that was pretty ambiguous. The second classification, I kind of label these as the key, like, leftist or radical articles.
Okay.
Article 22, right to Social Security. 23, right to work. 24, right to rest and leisure. 25, right to adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, housing, and healthcare. 26, right to education. 27, right to participate in cultural life and benefit from scientific progress. And can you read Article 23? We mentioned that it's right to work, but can you read the full article for me?
So it has 4 subpoints. 1, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favourable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. 2, everyone, without any discrimination, has the right to equal pay for equal work. 3, everyone who works has the right to just and favourable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity and supplemented, if necessary, by other means of social protection. 4, everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests.
Do you see this being upheld in any Western society today?
Maybe, but it's certainly under pressure and under threat.
That part about just and favorable remuneration, meaning money paid for work and services. In your view, we talk about AI. There's universal basic income has come up a few times in Western politics of late. Do you think that this is what this ideal is fighting for, even though it's 75 years old plus, or
universal basic income?
Yeah, or is that us reimagining this point?
To an extent, I think it's us reimagining it, but not unreasonably so, right? Like, I think that basically what that's saying is if you work, you should be able to live off of the work that you do. And I think there may have been a brief period in which that happened. I saw a graph the other day which said that in the US, if minimum wage... Tell me, Sam, do you know what minimum wage is in the United States right now, federally?
$7.50, I believe.
$7.50, yeah.
It's been that since I started working, and as we've established in some episodes, I'm old now.
Yeah. You are chopped and unk, but if workers today in the US were to have the same buying power that workers in the 1980 had, minimum wage would have to be like $49 an hour. And that's, I think, based on the Big Mac index, which is a pretty crude proxy, but even so.
I mean, a Big Mac is like twice the minimum wage at this point.
That's crazy. That's like Swiss prices. Wow.
Yeah, it's Swiss prices without Swiss pay.
Yeah. So like universal basic income could be a way of achieving this, for example, where it says supplemented if necessary by other means of social protection, but I don't think it's necessarily so. I think it's basically saying we should be paid more for the work that we do. Or
that cost of things should be limited by some mechanism of government. Do you see why I kind of call that second generation of rights? They're like the leftist ones, because they have to do with labor, they have to do with protecting labor and dignity of the worker.
I see that. It's about bread and roses, right? It's saying that we need the basics to live, but we also need joy and fulfillment and enrichment. And I think that these articles suit that.
After that, we get into a bit more abstract rights. As I mentioned, they're solidarity rights, and they're not discussed very often. Like Article 28 is everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. I mean, at the time, that's incredibly radical because it's not asking for a right within the system that existed, but a right to a new system.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you think that this point is so rarely discussed in human rights discourse?
Why Article 28 specifically is so rarely discussed?
And after, like, just that point of solidarity and a potential for a new system because the existing one does not protect their rights.
I think there's a few reasons. I think one is that ultimately, partly as a result of the structure of the United Nations itself, but partly just as a result of the development of geopolitics in the post-Second World War era, the nation state is the key unit of international representation, right? Laws are determined on a nation state level. And so whilst we can talk about a social and international order where rights and freedoms can be recognized, international orders in themselves have lacked teeth. Not to the same degree that the League of Nations did. Like, the UN does have a power to raise like peacekeeping forces and to lead interventions in some instances, but has repeatedly failed to do so, partly because oftentimes the interests of the most powerful nation states would be counter to the interests of the United Nations, and there is no way the United Nations could raise a military force to counter those most powerful nations, most specifically the United States and to a somewhat lesser extent the USSR. And even within the international order itself, by the time the United Nations had been founded in the 1940s, the Soviet Union, which was founded on internationalist principles, had somewhat turned away from its sort of internationalist perspective. That was a big, I think, debate within the early Soviet Union, most represented by the sort of struggle between Stalin and Trotsky as the two potential successors of Vladimir Lenin, which Stalin pretty decisively won, as we know from history, and the sort of international aims of the Soviet Union were weakened. There was still some international interest in furthering the aims of the Soviet Union for a sort of socialist goal, but it became much more about the interests of the Soviet Union rather than socialism in itself. And so international solidarity became constrained by the structures of the United Nations and the post-war order, and also there wasn't really anyone advocating for it, any of the big powers advocating for it on any sort of meaningful scale.
Yeah. When might is right, no one mighty is advocating for it, then it's not going to move forward.
That's a much more succinct way of putting it.
Sure. I wanted to ask you about protest and your firsthand experience now that we have this list of rights we're going over. When you were with Extinction Rebellion or when you were in Amsterdam protesting for Palestine, which of these rights felt most immediately under threat to you? Was it the right to assemble? Was it the right to life in the face of like climate collapse? And did the language of human rights feel more like abstract legalism than something that actually protected you?
Absolutely, they felt more abstract. I don't think it never really came up. The right to assembly, when I was with Extinction Rebellion, there were people being carried off by the police, but this was kind of before the more authoritarian turn, at least with the United Kingdom, of protest movements. The right to assembly felt much more threatened when I was protesting for Palestine in the Netherlands. And indeed, on one of the occasions on which we protested, protests had been banned because of the unrest that occurred in the wake of the football match between Maccabi Haifa and Ajax in Amsterdam, and the sort of riots that occurred as a result of that. Protests were banned, and yet we protested anyway. Our right to peaceful assembly was very deliberately curtailed and legally, quote unquote, curtailed. But that became something of a media spectacle. There were lots of cameras on us, and so the state acted very carefully until we were out of view of those cameras, and then the police brutality followed that.
Yeah.
But the human rights of the protesters themselves were never really salient points throughout any of this. It was more, I would say, about those latter points, actually, indirectly, although again, it didn't really come up. But the feeling was much more about a sort of international solidarity in terms of the rights of Palestinians and in terms of the rights of all of us to exist in a healthy biosphere.
That's really profound. Going back to the historical context of this, we've alluded to the fact that these rights are not codified anywhere, that they are not implemented, that right after they were written, they were pretty much ignored by the powers that be, even though they now had veto power in the UN. And there was kind of a split in, we've kind of discussed it, but those first articles, 1 through 21, that emphasize political and civil rights, they were really taken by the West and said, these are the rights we need to uphold. And you still even see that language used in the justification of the Vietnam War or the Iraq War, that they cite these rights that people should have individually as the reason for going to war, to liberate these people. While the Soviet bloc, they highlighted that other set of rights. They sought to highlight the economic and social and cultural rights of people, Articles 22 through 27. And this division was a clear signifier of that Cold War ideology. And obviously with the colonial veto power that the UK and France and America had, along with then the veto power of the Soviets, nothing could really be done to codify these into UN practice without them agreeing. And at that point, they weren't agreeing on much. And as you pointed to, a lack of enforcement. There were later attempts to codify, ratify these into some sort of international law. There was the International Covenants of 1966, but ultimately the courts have no way of holding these accountable. As you said, the UN does not have an army. There's also kind of the hypocrisy of it all with colonial powers, right? So the French and British empires were still very much intact in 1948. One example I have is what was going on in Algeria. There was the Sétif and Guelma massacres in 1945 from the French. And there was the suppression of the Malayan emergency in 1948 from the British. And this was happening as the declaration was being drafted. There's a quote from Aimé Césaire, if it's pronounced, I might be butchering that, but they wrote in Discourse on Colonialism in 1950.
They talked to me about progress, about achievements. Diseases cured, improved standards of living. I'm talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, broken institutions, lands confiscated, extrajudicial executions, and unpunished murder.
This was kind of happening all over the globe in the colonial world. What's your take on the fundamental hypocrisy of liberal human rights, that they're proclaimed by states that are simultaneously the primary violators of them?
David Graeber, who is something of an academic hero of mine, talked about this. He wasn't the only one. Sarah Ahmed, who's another anthropologist, talked about this. What they describe as affective documents, and not effective with an E, affective with an A. An affect in a sort of sociological, anthropological sense is a tool by which emotion is conveyed, a process by which emotion is conveyed. And so you see this a lot with corporations now, and sort of maybe anti-discrimination policies, things like that, where they say, or anti-bullying policies, where they might say, oh, you're being bullied. We've got this anti-bullying policy, and they will refer you to the anti-bullying policy. The point of that document is not to be adhered to. It is something to point to when an issue comes up. And I feel similarly about the sort of Western imperial hypocrisy around these human rights violations. They say, we are defending human rights, and they can point to this document as something that is a value, quote unquote, even though their actions in no way live up to that. It's sort of a smokescreen to hide it. That is the hypocrisy is the point. This is the shield by which they continue these actions.
There have been efforts of individual nations to try to codify some of the language used into their own constitutions, though these have been from more of those developing economies, non-aligned movements in the past. A notable case is South Africa in 1996 when they wrote their new constitution. It was considered to be one of the most progressive the world had seen since, and it includes not just civil and political rights, but justified economic and social rights, such as the right to housing, healthcare, food, water, and social security. And the South African people and their courts have ruled in favor of the right to housing and the right to HIV/AIDS medication as well, citing their constitution, which is inspired by the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, as we know, this doesn't play out in a tangible way always in South Africa. There is still a need and a want for these things with the general population. But that is the structure that Mandela and the ANC put in place back in the 90s. Similarly, like post-Franco Spain and Portugal, their democratic constitutions were directly inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well. So you do see it in place there. You see it as well as in other post-colonial nations like India, Kenya, and Nigeria. They drew heavily on this language when they established themselves as independent states as well. Again, just like South Africa, the way it actually plays out on the ground is kind of how it plays out with the UN as well, right? They have ideals they're not always lived up to. But the reason I've kind of brought us here today and discussed this topic is because, in 1948, these were a radical new way to idealize what should be the case in the world. And we've talked about Whig history before, the constant progress that some people are under the impression we are going on. Maybe the last few years have shattered that for some people. But I bring this up because it seems like we are in a lot worse of a place in terms of human rights than we have been previously. I mean, the UK, where you sit right now, it has kind of become a surveillance state, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
There was the Investigatory Powers Act in 2016, which pretty much mandates bulk data collection of the citizenry. There's facial recognition software, surveillance on journalists and activists. There's continuous application of this as well. There was 2022 and 2023 had additional sweeping powers given to police against protesters, which you know a lot about because some of these were targeted directly at environmentalists, right?
And especially Palestine.
I think what started as, at first, I think it was environmentalists, and then they shifted gears to use the same powers against pro-Palestine.
Yeah, whichever was the most annoying to them at the time. Palantir has 20 government contracts in the UK.
Oh, man.
With different agencies, more contracts overall, I should say.
And given these new anti-protest laws that have been implemented this year and from your time in the UK's left-wing circles, how have you seen protest tactics evolve in response to this legal quote-unquote crackdown? And does it force a move towards more disruptive protests or a more decentralized form of action?
I only moved to the UK a couple of months ago, and so I don't know that I am the best place to answer that question. But from what I've seen, I think there's a couple of things going on. One, in terms of more maybe drastic action. I don't know that is in response per se to the more sweeping powers that the government have. I think it's a response to inaction, and the more direct action protests are a result of government inaction from the more sort of standard protests where you go on marches and stuff like that. In response to things like Palestine protests in the wake of the prescription of Palestine action, which for legal purposes, I want to make it clear, I am not issuing my support for.
He does not support them. We gotta say it every time.
From a legal standpoint, that is true. But at the pro-Palestine protests, it's really quite inspiring. It's very elderly people who are often putting themselves at the forefront of these protests and getting themselves arrested. The average age of someone arrested at a pro-Palestine event is it's in their 60s, the average age.
Yeah.
And many are in their 80s. And that's a pretty interesting tactic. One, because it's a bad look. Two, when a reporter gets a picture of you carrying away an 80-year-old lady with a walking stick and you've got 6 police officers to do so, that's a bad look for the police. Two, the police themselves, they are human beings and they feel awful about doing so. Leaked reports from the Metropolitan Police in London that says morale is at rock bottom because of things like this. And because these are people for whom these getting slapped with a trumped up terror charge is not such a big issue. That's something that I think is a direct response to the increase in Police Powers Act that I think is really inspiring. And the other, I think, is I've seen a lot of information going around the WhatsApp channels, the Signal channels, whatever, of people saying, look, these are the tools that are going to be in place. Here's how you protect yourself against that. And something that saw particularly in the Netherlands, but that I'm sure applies in the UK and elsewhere as well, is bits of advice like leave your ID at home, switch off Face ID on your phone.
We did a whole episode on this, right?
We did, exactly. So those tactics are very modern tactics for these sort of modern problems in that way.
That leads me nicely into my next question for you, which is, does this constant presence of monitoring, whether it's social media or out in public, does this foster paranoia or solidarity in a protest movement?
I think it fosters solidarity more so than paranoia for the most part. I think people are aware of their situation. It's quite easy to spot an undercover cop in a protest. Usually, maybe that's a ruse. Like maybe the police are aware of what an undercover cop looks like, and so they put people who look like that to distract from the actual undercover cops. That is a distinct possibility. But like in the Netherlands, it felt super easy. It was the buff guys with short haircuts and skinny jeans, often wearing like Letterman jackets as well. It's just quite funny. And you just walk past them and go, "Hello, officer." it would be quite recognizable. But I think that in general, people are aware of the scale of the challenge that we're up against, and that links people together and encourages people to find ways to support each other in this sort of fight. I remember a story from my undergraduate days. An amazing lecturer I had, Aaron Parkhurst, who's an anthropologist at UCL, and we were talking about the panopticon. This is a philosophical idea. The panopticon is a circular prison with a guard tower in the center that could, in theory, look into any cell at any time. And so the idea is that it would create perfect discipline because anyone might be being observed at any given time. This was heavily proposed by Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher, and he thought of it as a progressive thing. He thought it might reduce the need for state violence because of this constant threat of surveillance. It's become something quite regressive. But Aaron Parkhurst, this academic, argued we are now living in a post-panopticon world. The panopticon exists. We are being monitored, or could be being monitored, at all times. And so, the theory goes, fuck it. Just do what you want to do anyway. He told the story of these guys robbing a bank. And they were robbing a bank wearing ski masks. And then they walked out of the bank carrying their loot. And one of them looks dead in a security camera, pulls off his mask, blows the camera a kiss. They are never found.
Wow.
We're in the post-panopticon world, so fuck it.
There you go. I'm going to skip talk on the United States because it kind of goes without saying that human rights violations are the norm these days. See our conversation about the frog earlier. But I wanted to point to a different sort of example, China, because they encroach on many human rights. There's mass surveillance in Xinjiang. There was suppression of dissent in Hong Kong. There's the absence of free speech, essentially. There's no freedom of assembly. But while China has also lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, and this fulfills a material aspect of Article 25 of the Declaration of Human Rights, it systematically denies the political and civil rights in the Declaration. And it represents a model where economic rights are granted in exchange for political submission. So China really presents a model where certain material rights are provided. They're a trade-off for political liberty. How stable is that bargain? Is a dignified life possible without the right to question one's own government?
There's a few points there that I would like to respond to. But I think that the question you actually asked around the sort of balance between material benefit and abstract rights that go along with it, or that maybe should go along with it, I think that question as an abstract question is maybe easier to answer than in the specific case of China. And so I'm going to, on the one hand, in the specific case of China, I'm going to put a pin in that because that is something that I would like to do some research into and then maybe do an episode about, and maybe do an episode responding to that question in the case of China, because I think that China is fascinating and that's something that we often don't get the full story of in the West. But in regards to specifically a balance between material wealth and freedom, personal freedoms, I think that ultimately when we talk about freedom, and I'm going to use the framework of freedom because there are two kinds of freedom, right? There's freedom from poverty, the freedom from aggression, the freedom from danger, and there's the freedom to assemble, the freedom to speak your mind, the freedom to create, etc. Ultimately, these have to coexist. The freedom to live your life in the way you see fit has to be going alongside the freedom from any of these things, because the two rest upon each other. You can't have the freedom to speak your mind unless you have the freedom from threat. And similarly, if you have freedom, quote unquote, is backed by a state that will do you harm if you fall out of their narrow parameters of freedom, then how are you really free, even if there is no violent presence? The non-presence of violence is underpinned by the threat of violence, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that ultimately the two have to coexist. maybe there has been a devil's bargain made in the cases of various wealthy states. I know that in authoritarian states, oftentimes, and again, divorcing this from China until research has been done, but in authoritarian states, often incredible freedom exists within those 4 certain in-groups, right? But the in-group will by necessity be a small portion of the population in general. And I believe, as I'm sure you do, that none of us are free until all of us are free. And so that includes the freedom from and the freedom to.
Absolutely. And I do look forward to you doing some research and bringing it back to us on China, because I think I asked that question because I don't have an answer for it. Because as we've seen in the West now, we don't have what we bargained for in that social contract. Whereas they do, kind of.
Yeah.
People.
Yeah, they've gotten richer for sure. They've got trains that go 500 kilometers an hour.
Yeah, I see that type of society in the state it's in now, where a majority are prospering under what could potentially be an authoritarian rule if push came to shove, as sort of that dog that happily runs around the yard with a collar that will then zap them if they go too far away. At the moment, they've never had a need to go out of the yard, so they feel very free.
Interesting.
But we'll see. That also, I think, is the case 100% with the UK and American populations, and we are now trying to go beyond that fence and getting shocked.
I think the fence has shrunk, but yes, I see your point.
Yeah. There's more than just those examples. I mean, in a global context, India, has sedition laws and internet shutdowns, especially when it comes to the political topic of Kashmir. Whenever things pop off there, there's usually a blackout of the internet. Brazil, attacks on indigenous land rights and environmental defenders under Jair Bolsonaro. And then obviously Israel-Palestine, and what Israel has been doing kind of spits in the face of this declaration. I think we can kind of look historically at all of this and say, when it's taught neatly, oftentimes liberal or conservative teachers will teach the failures of the League of Nations and the successes of the United Nations. But I think what's clear is that we're living in a pretty long-term failure of the UN, in that its structure itself has hindered it from achieving the goals that it set out to do. And we know personally that there are people that work for the UN that are amazing, brilliant people, but that damn veto power of the world powers really stops a lot of progress and stops these rights from being implemented around the world in a meaningful way, amongst other things. And that kind of brings up, like, how do we use this declaration, and should we use it at all? Should we throw it by the wayside and start over? And it comes back to what I asked at the top, like, what are we fighting for?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was hanging in the entranceway of my high school.
Of course it was. In Switzerland.
In Switzerland. I would go into high school every day, and the first thing I would see hanging on the wall would be the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was not in a super prominent position, like you might not notice it if you weren't looking out for it, but I noticed it every day when I walked in. Maybe not every day, I was a teenager, but often enough. And for me personally, I think that was really inspiring, and maybe not in terms of the rights themselves. I don't know how much I took that on board, but in the idea that this was something possessed by all people on Earth, and that all people on Earth had a certain dignity and equality in a hypothetical scenario, at least, was powerful to me, as was when I was in an English class and we were talking about basis of rights, I think, and the English teacher asked what the basis of our rights were. And I said, well, we've got this document hanging up downstairs. And he said something to the effect of, if you think that that's not like a very culturally specific document, then you're very mistaken. I don't even remember the rest of that conversation, but I remember that. And I remember thinking about, this document that professed these rights, but understanding that it existed within a superstructure that was bigger and more complicated than the document itself was very formative for me personally. So for me, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a very important document because it helped me to understand kind of exactly what we've talked about, right? Like the ideals of everyone having this set of rights, but also the limitations within that in a very real and practical sense. I don't know that it can be that for everyone. I don't think everyone will have those learning opportunities in the same way. I'm very fortunate in the learning opportunities that I've had, but I do think that as a model or as an ideal to, maybe not even in its extant form, but in the sort of abstract and a sort of abstract idea of a universal set of human rights, that is a powerful and worthwhile ideal, recognizing that in its current form it is limited.
Let me tell you the first time I ever read this document, and it reminded me of how American I am. It was when I was getting my master's in the UK, and I had a Dutch professor of politics who I believe grew up in The Hague, and I told her I had never heard of this before.
In your master's, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And she looked like appalled. I was like, what do you mean? Because I was reading these, I was like, hell yeah, these all sound great. Like, why is this not, it's not taught to American students in any curriculum. Like, I was in California, which is one of the more globally minded curriculums in the States, which is not saying a lot, but still. And I could have come across it in university. It was just my specific direction didn't lead me that way. And there wasn't a specific curriculum on it in university either. So, like, yeah, my professor from the Netherlands was just appalled, but also like, okay, well, at least you're here now learning this. Because I was like, wow, these are great. Why does the world not want to adopt these? There's something to be said about taking these as a baseline, as you kind of put it, where I think we need to look as leftists beyond the liberalism of the document. And there is also something to be said in this world we live in now, where there's so much rhetoric against immigrants, against people that don't look like us, people that don't think like us. There's something to be said about acknowledging the dignity of every human being, because sadly that seems to be a minority position in Western politics these days.
Well said.
And I think I want to close out with a couple of questions for you, because I saw just today that Pope Leo stated that the need to uphold the human element of society in the face of technology should be a right in itself and one that is in danger, which I found quite on the nose these days. That led me to think, if you could add one new article to this declaration for the 21st century, like, what would it be? Would it be, digital privacy as a right, or right to a stable climate, or doesn't not need to be just one, but like, what do you think is missing from this declaration that would satisfy it for you?
I think that what you mentioned about the climate is close. I think I would word it, and maybe it would have to be a couple of articles within the declaration, but it would be something to the effect of the right to a thriving planet, a thriving biosphere, and also a recognition perhaps within the preamble, because we haven't talked about the preamble, but the preamble of UN declarations have two portions: the preamble, where it sort of sets up the context, and the articles where it makes the sort of actionable statements. Mm-hmm. And the preamble sets like a context for the document. So the first line is, whereas recognition, they always start with whereas.
Yeah.
Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. I would probably add something to the effect that affirms that we exist as a part of the biosphere, and emphasizing that we are not separate from it, but that we are merely another species that exists on Earth. And I think that that's a sort of call within the international framework for all of us, but especially those of us that live within the imperial core, to return to a sort of sense of indigeneity, to build a relationship with the land that we live on. I think that inherently comes with what we might consider progressive ideals, although they are the most traditional ideals that they are, these sort of indigenous principles in many ways, and also builds a basis for a more sustainable and indeed happier future. What would you add?
I think there's so much that I would just want enforced. I think the workers' rights and the right to a dignified home and place of residence that they mention, I don't see being applied anywhere in the West, really. And I think that's a very basic right. The right to shelter is not a guarantee right now. And I think that would just be something that I would want to enforce But then I also agree with Pope Leo in that I read that the AI bubble is about 17 times bigger than the .com bubble was.
Wow.
And may come spiraling down sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Who knows? But I think we're in for some hurt in this economy globally. And I think just a right to protection of human dignity and income and, you know, a life that is worth living is important. And maybe it will take that shock for people to start looking at human rights again in this way.
Yeah. The housing would be a particularly, like, it'd be a very easy one to fix. You know how many homeless people there are in the US?
I don't know the number specifically.
So it's about 600,000. You know how many empty homes there are in the US?
1 million?
17 million.
Wow.
Every homeless person could have 25 homes without building any new homes. So it's really just a distribution problem.
But Adam, how could the rich then have a portfolio?
I hadn't thought of that. Wow. Oh, God.
It's a big...
You're right.
That's the most
Tear it
important
up.
right of all, is the right to a portfolio for 1% of the population.
How could I forget? Write it in, boys.
I do have one last question. This is the one I was alluding to earlier, which is, this one's an anthropology one, I promise.
Okay.
Have you encountered a concept of rights or dignity from a non-Western tradition that you feel could strengthen or challenge the framework of the Declaration?
Yes, although they may not be called rights, or if they are, it is a deliberate sort of appropriation of the language of the United Nations in order to gain legitimacy recognition in this way. Well, there are a couple of authors that I would really point to in these terms, one of whom, the less accessible, is Davi Kopenawa Yanomami, who is a shaman of the Yanomami people in Brazil. He wrote an amazing book in collaboration with the French anthropologist called Bruce Albert called The Falling Sky, which is a series of shamanic dreams that are recounted. And he is an indigenous rights activist, but more so his son, whose name escapes me, but I have seen him talk very inspirationally, is an indigenous rights activist. And they talk about indigenous rights and also the role of indigenous peoples as stewards of the natural world in a very inspiring way. But it is a very dense book. It's like 600 pages and quite a beautiful but somewhat technical read. The one that is more accessible is Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a member of the she's Potawatomi, that is her indigenous nation. She works in the, I can't remember the exact name of it, but it's like the Indigenous Studies Center in upstate New York. And she wrote a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a pretty popular book. You might have seen it about, but it is beautifully written and again talks about sort of not only, this is more about the sort of indigenous relationship to the natural world, but she does talk a lot about our sort of, I guess, rights in regard to the natural world. She doesn't frame it in that way, but I do think that's what she's talking about a lot of the time, and talks about it in interesting ways. Like in one of her pieces, she talks about how with conserving the natural world, we're maybe barking up the wrong tree, and what we need to focus on are building sites of engagement with the natural world. So, for example, parks, the purpose of which is to forage wild blackberries or whatever it might be, the sort of locally appropriate fruit in your biome. Yeah, those two come to mind. I'm sure there are others.
Yeah, not a right per se, but like to embrace the opportunity to be a herald of the earth.
Yeah, there's that, and the other one that is not a right per se, but is, I think, very interesting. There is a famous paper called Stone Age Economics, author Marshall Salins, professor, I believe now emeritus at the University of Chicago. He wrote an essay called The Original Affluent Society in a journal, or in a piece, as part of a wider piece called Stone Age Economics, and it looked at a truly egalitarian society in the Khoisan people in Namibia, and this examined sort of the rights of the group over the individual, I suppose, in a way. No individual of this group owns more than they can carry, so they are not tied to a specific place. And there are various social mechanisms by which that quality of outcome, because in the West, when we talk about equality, we mean equality of opportunity. It's not what's given, but it is what is meant, is equality of opportunity. This group has equality of outcome, and that is enforced through various social means, social levers. Shame, for example, is employed quite effectively. And I think that is quite a radically different framework for rights than we tend to think about, specifically in the context of this document. But I do think it would be very interesting for people to learn more about. Maybe we'll do an episode about it.
You should. But
it's not protest per se,
incredibly...
but it is interesting.
Well, I mean, we're protesting for something, right? And that's kind of the point of this episode is what are we protesting for? And you raise a very important point about liberal versus leftist, right? And I think we share the same rights stated that we want people to have, but I think you put it beautifully there in that it's opportunity versus outcome. And I think leftists in general want an outcome for everyone, whereas people that defend capitalists is defending the opportunity rather than the outcome.
I, on the one hand, kind of agree with you, but what I actually think is that the more maybe salient difference between leftists and liberals is that liberals say they want equality of opportunity, but will do nothing to bring it about, whereas leftists actually do want it and will work to bring about an equality of opportunity. I think that's maybe more accurate. An equality of outcome has its place, but I think is a more complicated topic that I would love to delve into another time.
Yeah, sure. But I think those are very good points. We can end with that. And I think the reason for me bringing this declaration to the table today was to discuss what are we protesting for, what are we fighting for, and what already exists as a mechanism that we can turn to. We can critique that, we can build on it, we can throw it away. That's up to all of us to decide. But I do think that when leftists go about things, they can kind of hear a term like human rights and immediately it might jump to being a liberal cliche in their head that, so many people have espoused but don't live by, don't actually strive for. But I think we should view it as a debt owed by the powerful to the powerless and a debt that they have no intention of paying. So that perhaps is the most revolutionary reason to keep fighting. Thank you for listening, dear listener. Please share our podcast if you enjoy it. And we will see you next week. Adam, can you close us out with a quote from one of the framers of this declaration, Eleanor Roosevelt? And I think this quote can be taken in a nefarious way, but I believe that protesters can also use it as a form of inspiration.
Rights are won only by those who make their voices heard.